Development Switzerland and the Advanced Management Program at Harvard Business School, USA. It is with pleasure that we welcome His Excellency Ambassador Mirpuri.
Thank you, James, and thank you for putting on a suit in my honor. I know students don't usually wear suits on school days, and thank you all for coming today to listen to what I see as the US's evolving role in the Asia Pacific. And in a sense, your maps all now need to change. You no longer should have the Atlantic Ocean where it is. It really needs to change and put the Pacific Ocean right there in the middle, because the Pacific relationships are going to be quite critical for the US and for all of you as you develop your futures. Now, I subtitled my talk, "The Little Red Dot Turns 50." Now, what is the little red dot? And let me point it out for you here. That little thing there, Singapore, that's the little red dot. And that's the United States. So just to put everything in a context, your Great Salt Lake is 6 times the size of Singapore. Your Utah Lake is just slightly smaller than Singapore. So the next time you pass the lake, just think that we have 5 million people on land the size of that lake. So it's just geographically, dramatically different from everything that you are used to here in the United States. Here you're used to in Utah. But we've really had to use our geography and our space to make ourselves globally relevant. And I said the little red dot turns 50. We turned 50 because 2015 is the 50th anniversary of Singapore's independence. We became independent in 1965. So when I met the governor this morning and he told me you're a very young state, I told him we're a very young country. And it was an independence that was not something that we actually sought. It was thrust upon us because of ethnic and religious issues and differences. And we emerged as a nation on the 9th of August with absolutely no resources. We have to import all of our energy, we have to import all of our food, and we even have to import most of our water. So what we had to do with Singapore over 50 years, and the reason so many of you are here today because you have heard about Singapore, many of you have been there in Singapore, and we're really considered one of the most successful countries of the previous half century. But we've had to use our people. We've had to focus on education, stepping up education, building up the whole capital value around education, and making sure we move forward into that future. And that's been a very important part of where Singapore sees itself today and in that future. But the little red dot also has an interesting history for us, because as I pointed out, we are the red dot, and as you walk by, it's not shown on this map, but on many maps, Singapore is marked by that little red dot. That's the whole geography of it. You come down the Straits of Malacca, a very important straits, and that you have to stop in Singapore. And the British actually picked Singapore as their port in 1819. And so we became very important as a shipping port. We built that up as a civil aviation port. But in 1998, when I was serving in Indonesia, when James introduced me, I served in Indonesia in 1998. Indonesia was going through a very difficult political crisis. And in that political crisis, one of the comments that the then president made was that Singapore is just a little red dot. It was meant as a dismissive tone because we had a fairly difficult relationship at that time with Indonesia. Now, being a small, pragmatic, practical country, we took the fact that he called us a red dot and made it into a positive. So today we celebrate the red dot in Singapore. When you go to Singapore, you'll see there is a red dot museum. There's a whole history of the red dot. It's really something that signifies Singapore for the future. And that's where we really see that. How do you use your weaknesses? How do you use your lack of strengths and make those into positives? Whether it was size, whether it was geography, and really stepping forward and now building up very good relationships, obviously, with our neighbors. But one of our most important relationships over the past 50 years has been with the United States. And we see that evolving US role in the Asia-Pacific as very critical for our own success as well. So how have Singapore and the US really worked together over these past 50 years? There's a broad range of areas. It started in 1965, just as we became independent. Because at that time, the US had committed itself to the war in Vietnam, to fight communism in Vietnam. And it was a war that was obviously in the US, not a fairly popular war, a very controversial conflict. But in Southeast Asia, we've always seen it as a very important process of the US engaging itself with the Asia-Pacific, because what the US committed to do in Southeast Asia to hold the line against communism allowed the non-communist parts of Southeast Asia to come together and focus on economic development. The 5 original members of the Southeast Asian grouping called ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which was formed in 1967, all were dealing with communist insurgencies at that time. Singapore had it. Malaysia, another member of ASEAN, had the communist insurgency. Indonesia had just gone through a attempted communist coup in 1965. Philippines and Thailand also had communist insurgencies. So we've been very grateful for the US since that time for their commitment to the Southeast Asia. But we decided to build on this. What Singapore did as we became independent in 1965, as I mentioned, with no resources, with a high unemployment rate, with no industries of our own, was really then try to attract global multinationals to come and invest in Singapore. Because the first priority for us was, of course, jobs. Because without jobs, you couldn't build up the whole economy. And many of these multinationals were American multinationals who committed to Singapore with an uncertain future and said that we would like to be present in this part of the world. They first came because of the low labor costs, obviously, and then that ability to reach out to the region. But over the years, we've been able to build up that relationship, the economic relationship, that today, if you look at a list of global Fortune 500 companies from the US, most of them have a large presence in Singapore. And they use that Singapore presence to reach out to the wider region. And we've been able to grow that presence from the traditional low-cost labor manufacturing to very high-tech, capital-intensive manufacturing. As I was driving to Provo this morning, we passed the Micron facility. Micron has very large facilities in Singapore doing manufacturing. And as you go around, you will see many of these tech companies are linked with Singapore. Companies have started putting in place innovation and entrepreneurship hubs out of Singapore. They use that to reach out to the region because Singapore has the rule of law, the intellectual property protection, and the right economic ecosystem that helps companies to use us as a base to go regional. Today, there are more US investments in Singapore than there are in India and China combined. Take a quick look at the map. Look at the size of India and China combined. And look at my little red dot. And think of the fact that we've got more US investments where we are than in these two countries. In fact, anywhere else than the Asia Pacific. Because by creating that right economic environment, it's allowed US companies then to go regional. And we work with them. We've set up institutes and facilities that can work with them that help them convert their products and make them more relevant to the Asian consumer. And that's really where we see the future going forward. Now, the US has also been a very important security partner for the Asia Pacific. I mentioned the Vietnam War. Of course, then there was a process of withdrawal from that. But Singapore has also opened up our military facilities for the US to use. The US was a very active presence in parts of Southeast Asia until 1990, when political changes in some of the Southeast Asian countries forced the US to withdraw from their bases in those countries. Singapore then opened up our naval facilities and our air facilities for the US to use. Now, we couldn't replicate, obviously, a base because we didn't want to have a base. But today, the US Navy extensively uses the Singapore naval facilities. We've built them up to be able to accommodate your largest vessels, the aircraft carriers. There are these new vessels in the US Navy called littoral combat ships. They are rotationally deployed out of Singapore. And by being in Singapore, they're then able to operate within the whole region. when there was a plane crash earlier this year in the Java Sea, the USS Fort Worth, which was based out of Singapore, was able to be very quickly there to help in search and rescue operations. Every time there's a humanitarian disaster, and you read about it regularly in Southeast Asia, whether it's in the Philippines or Indonesia, the US is able to use the facilities that we allow them in Singapore to be able to reach out. And in return, the security relationship has also expanded to Singapore being able to use US military facilities. In Idaho, in Texas, in Arizona, we have Singapore squadrons based over there doing very extensive flight training because, again, given our geography, we're not able to do too much flight training where we are because it's a very active civil aviation space as well. So it's a very close relationship that's allowed us also to participate with the US in some of the key coalitions that you have formed to deal with some of the challenges around Islamic terrorism. We're part of the anti-ISIL coalition. We joined the US in Afghanistan and Iraq because we see some of those challenges as global challenges. And we see the US playing a very strong leadership role in many of these areas. So it's something that my leadership encourages and we work closely with the US on. And we hope to keep building on this relationship even as new challenges emerge, areas like cybersecurity and other parts of the security relationship that we will build on. The economic relationship, I mentioned about the US companies that are based in Singapore, but there's also structural agreements that we've put in place. Singapore was the first free Asian country to have a free trade agreement with the US. We started negotiating that at the end of 1999, and it came into force 11 years ago, and it's seen a very dramatic rise in trade and services between Singapore and the US. In fact, it's one of the few countries the US actually has a surplus with, a trade surplus with, because we import so much of US products. But we have used that Singapore-US Free Trade Agreement as a platform to build the wider Asia-Pacific relationships. Just last week, we concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. That's an agreement of 12 countries around the Pacific, which is why I said the map needs to be reoriented around the Pacific. That has the United States, Singapore, Canada, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, coming together into a new agreement that really looks towards the future, with new intellectual property rules, with new transparency rules, with supply chains that will grow across the region that would help to build up these economic links. And it's very important for US businesses and consumers because you will be able to get, obviously, products from around the region at much lower tariffs, but you will also be able to sell your products out around the region. And where the growth areas of the global economy are going to be in the Asia-Pacific, where you have the largest growing middle class that all want to have US products and US services. So we see it very critical for the US. We also see it as very important for the Asia-Pacific. And in the Asia-Pacific, security and economics are very closely tied together. We don't separate one from the other. It's really a commitment of the US engagement with the Asia-Pacific that the President and the Congress has really come together to support this agreement and really look ahead for where the US will play a strategic economic and political role in the region. We still have some hurdles around the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, having just completed it last week. It will go out and be put out for public comment soon, and then it will go for ratification in Congress. And I hope, of course, it will be a uncomplicated ratification process, as do the other 11 countries will also have to go through their own domestic processes to get it through the agreement. With Singapore as well, we've built up new areas of cooperation with the US, largely focused on development and education. With development, Singapore and the US signed something called a third country training program that allows your trainers and our trainers to work together with developing countries in the region to train them in new areas of expertise. We work around water resources, trade facilitation, humanitarian assistance. It's again our way of engaging the US much more in the Asia-Pacific going forward. And as we build in Southeast Asia a strong foundation around the ASEAN Economic Community, which will come into force at the end of this year, these sorts of programs and partnerships make it even more important. Education is another area where Singapore and the US work very closely together. A number of US universities, not yet your university, have set up partnerships with Singapore. Yale has set up with our university a liberal arts school. MIT has set up with our universities, the Singapore University of Technology and Design. Duke runs a medical school in Singapore in parallel with our own medical school system. We also have universities coming from the UK and other parts of the world, because education is such a fundamental part of Singapore's growth in the future. But what they hope to be able to do in Singapore, the US institutions, is really relook at some of the teaching of some of the subjects. It's not just transplanting an institution in Singapore and then hoping to replicate that American model over there. It's taking the best of the US system and the best of the Singapore system and pulling those together. We have large numbers of students who come to the US on exchange programs. Those who go to our universities in Singapore are encouraged to spend a semester abroad on exchange programs. Many come over here. And obviously we have Singapore students coming here, like James, to spend 4-year undergraduate programs here, postgraduate programs here. And these really become a very important part of the ties going forward. But now coming to this evolving role that the US plays in the Asia Pacific, the history has been very positive. And the history has been critical to how we see the future. Because the US plays what we call the resident power role in the Asia Pacific, even as we have new geopolitical challenges arising in the region. The first geopolitical challenge is really how the Asia Pacific is coming together, particularly with the rise of China. Now, the Chinese president just had a very successful visit to the US earlier this month. And the rise of China provides lots of opportunities for the Asia Pacific. China is a growing economic partner. They have offered new ideas for infrastructure development. The Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, something called One Belt, One Road, that links the old traditional Silk routes, both overland and through the seas. And that's been very good for the Asia Pacific. But in that, we also want to see a strong US role, because all these programs do not yet have a role for the US to play. Some of them the US decided to sit out and not participate in, like the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank. And some of the others, like the One Belt, One Road, really don't see a role for the US. What we want to see as US-China relations will develop over the future, a very positive, cooperative relationship between the US and China, but one that leads to peace in the Asia-Pacific. Because the strong focus of the Asia-Pacific, just as it is here in Utah and the US, is really economic development for the people. And we think that conflict will actually be bad for us. There are territorial disputes that you may have heard about. The South China Sea territorial disputes are one of the major ones that keep emerging in the news. We hope that these can be resolved peacefully. Singapore does not have a claim in any of the South China Sea islands. They're a little bit too far away from where we are. But as a major global trading country, freedom of navigation and overflight is critical for us, and peaceful resolution of these disputes, so that you would ensure that the shipping that goes through Singapore on the way to the rest of the East Asia would be unhindered. And we're trying to work with the Chinese, something called a code of conduct, to avoid an accident taking place in that region as we go forward. Because these disputes, territorial disputes, can be complicated, and a number of Southeast Asian countries and China have competing claims around there. And in that, again, we see the US playing an important role, because the US has benefited and in many ways drawn up the rules of freedom of navigation, drawn up the rules of international law. And these are areas that we can see that putting a layer of the US continued commitment to the region will help us develop as we work out our relationships in the Asia Pacific. There are also important relationships with Japan and Korea that ASEAN has. And again, the US has strong partnerships with these countries. So for the future, it's something that we see the US really actively engaged in the Asia Pacific. First and foremost, for the good of the US itself, because your companies will need to be there. Many of you will need to be there. You will want to go out and see the growing sort of opportunities over there. But also because US security, the security and economic future of the US will be guaranteed to its very strong commitment to the Asia Pacific. As a global superpower, the world looks to the US to be able to play that role. And as a little red dot, that's a very good friend of the global superpower, we will be by your side trying to work through some of this. So let me stop over there, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have, either on the red dot or anything else. Thank you.
So now the burden goes to you, now that we have a lot of time for you to ask questions. So again, as I mentioned in the beginning, please form a line behind the microphone. We'd ask you to introduce yourself, tell us your name and your major, what you're studying, and then please ask your question. You can stay there to listen to your answer. And again, as you're ready to ask your question, please form a line so we can be as efficient as possible with the time that we have. Please.
I don't see a rush for the line.
First one's always the scariest.
So the students don't want to ask.
Okay, so you
Don't want to miss an opportunity.
get a tough question from the professor then.
No, I would just like you to talk a little bit more about the TPP. This was recently announced. This has been many years in the process. I mean, it does exclude China, but as soon as it was announced, of course, the American political system kicked into gear. A lot of opposition from Congress. I don't think Donald Trump has read it, but he said it was the worst agreement he'd ever seen. Hillary Clinton has actually now somewhat indicated to turn against it, even though she was a part of negotiating. As Singapore, given the experience that Korea had with the United States in negotiating and passing our free trade agreement, there's a huge challenge ahead. What role will you play as ambassador? What role will Singapore play in lobbying and schmoozing with the U.S. congressional people to get them on board to pass the TPP?
Well, I won't speak about the U.S. political process as a good ambassador. How you work out, how people read the agreements and understand the agreements. It's been a complicated agreement to pull through. And in the process of that complicated agreement, when Singapore and the U.S. did our free trade agreement, and you know the asymmetric sizes of the countries, of the economies, it still took us 5 years to get an agreement. We have 12 countries, including Japan, which is the world's third largest economy, Australia, Canada, Mexico, to all come together and say that we see a committed future together is just a very important part of linking these economies. And for the US to play the lead. Actually, TPP started with Singapore. We have to take some responsibility, which means we will take a very strong role in pushing to have it ratified. We started with something called the P4, which links Singapore, Brunei, New Zealand, and Chile across the Pacific. And we thought that this was the way of the future. And the US then joined in and saw that its future was really linked, as they did the pivot to Asia 5 or 6 years ago. They saw TPP as part of the pivot to Asia. The important message that I give to members of Congress when it does come up for ratification is that in the Asia-Pacific, trade is strategy. Without trade, the US is left out of everything happening in the region. Because if you look at what's happening in the region, there are other processes taking place that do not have a role for the US. I mentioned One Belt, One Road, the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank. We have something called a Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which involves the 10 Southeast Asian countries with China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. The US is not part of that. We have other free trade agreements that don't have the US to play a role. So the region will continue. But where does the US then position itself into this? And the TPP is unique because we wanted to draft rules for the 21st century. So you're looking at new areas, services, data flows. How do these become quite important? Now this is something that I and my fellow TPP ambassadors in Washington play a very active role on. We reach out to members of Congress. Our leaders speak strongly about this, engaging in a bipartisan spirit. It's not something for one party or the other, because this is really a long-term agreement. You spoke about excluding China. Actually, China is not excluded. They just haven't come in yet. Think of the TPP as Lego blocks. You've all played with Lego blocks. They're red, they're blue, they're green, and we've put this together into the agreement. It's not as elegant, because you're sort of adding bits and pieces, and so some people will complain that this is not the perfect agreement, it is not the perfect Lego block. But the way it's built is that everyone has their own little blocks to come and add on to it. We really see countries coming on. Korea is not part of the TPP. They're part of CORUS. They want to join now. The Korean president is in Washington this week, and it's a very strong message. Countries that have difficulty moving towards economic openness suddenly realize that if you're not in it, you are extremely out of it. So I've just read over the past week, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand say, how do we get into this? China initially said this is part of containing China. Then they realized actually it's meant for you to come in eventually. So it will be a long process. It is really the start of a process. And there will be countries which may find it very hard to come up to the standards that have been laid, because the idea is to lay high standards. So we've got to look also at bridges along the way to help them move along. But we don't really see it as the end all. This is, as I said, think of it as that my Lego blocks, you know, and we're going to keep adding on to it and adding on to it until we get something that everyone can come in and join. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Jacob Valentine. I'm an undergrad here.
What are you studying?
I'm a double major in economics and mathematics.
Thanks.
Okay.
I have a question. So I lived in the Philippines for a while. I want to know what your opinion is as to the development of Singapore, as well as the other Asian tigers, as they've been called, versus those of countries like the Philippines or Thailand. You know, similar areas, but very, well, drastically different paths, I guess, economically. I'm wondering what your thoughts are as to why the development of Singapore was different.
Thank you. Well, Singapore has been called the country that went from third world to first,
Right.
effectively in 50 years. And we're very careful to say that what we achieved in Singapore is not necessarily a model for everybody else. Each country has had to have its own system of economic development. You look at the Philippines, 7,000 islands, an archipelagic state, spread out, rural and urban populations, land holdings which are very large, as well as very, very small holdings. All this has to be accommodated with a very complicated colonial history that include the Spanish, that included the Americans. And so when they became independent, you have to deal with all these factors. And much as, you know, they want to succeed. And in fact, Philippines today is considered one of the most successful economies of Southeast Asia over the past 3 to 5 years. Under the current president, they have done very well. And they did go through a very complicated past with President Marcos as well, who had to step down from office, forced away from office. So when you put all these together, then you realize that they need an economic model of their own that may not work with Singapore's model. Singapore, we have British colonial history, and the British, to their credit, were actually fairly good colonialists. They helped set in place first the teaching of English in Singapore. So every student in Singapore learns English as a first language. Then they have to learn a second language, which comes from their own culture. We're a multi-ethnic society, 70% Chinese, about 14% Muslim, 8% Indians, and then a whole mix of others. You go to school, you learn English as your first language, and you learn a second language based on your mother tongue. So everyone becomes bilingual. The British also helped set in place the focus on the globe because they used us as a trading port. But then when we became independent and we had no real future, I think where you sometimes differ from some of the other economic models you see, and you said you're studying economics and you may have studied economic development, a lot of countries in the early phases went for import substitution. Singapore had no imports to substitute because we really didn't have enough commodity base of our own to create our own cotton or our own textiles. We had to go into an export-oriented type of industrialization. And that model, I think, has helped us grow into the global sort of future. Because by saying that I'm just not going to survive on supporting 3 or 5 million people, I have to support a whole region. Whereas the Philippines with 60 or 70 million can say, let me get my agricultural right, let me get my industrialization right because I've got enough of a market domestically. So very diametrically changed model of development. And if you look at all those Asian tigers, Taiwan, Korea, they all moved in that sort of, let's go towards an export-oriented growth rather than import substitution growth. And in the 1960s, no one knew which model was going to work, to be fair. Today, in hindsight, you can say that may have been the better model. And in fact, China's growth over the past 3 or 4 decades has been really export-oriented, the growth of exports. They could have gone for a very import substitution model as well, as India has done a little bit of that. So when you look at these different economic histories of these different countries, but also their political histories, and you understand the different challenges they face, there's no one-size-fits-all model in many ways. And Singapore was fortunate. We had a very visionary leadership that had traveled the world, that understood that you've got to focus on that world, one of the reasons why we had to leave Malaysia was just our choice of wanting to use English as the first language. Whereas in Malaysia, they wanted to use Malay as the first language and English coming as second language. We said, no, we have to fit into a global future. So you make certain choices, you never know what may work right. And you then move forward. And we want Philippines to succeed, and I'm glad that within the ASEAN context now, the 10 of us have come together to create an ASEAN economic community that will be set in place by the end of this year. Again, really a work in progress because there's much to be done, but it will reduce tariffs between the countries. It would allow better sort of supply chains to operate within the region. And Singapore succeeds when the region succeeds well. So we really want to work with these countries, and we work with the US as well very closely in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Devin Studweeks. I'm an Asian Studies major. I had a question regarding the stance of Singaporean people on neocolonialism. You mentioned that other countries had in the Asia Pacific region had moved against having U.S. military involvement, or but
US
Singapore has
businesses,
done but Singapore has done the opposite. And obviously Singapore speaks English as their first language, so they have a different stance on that. But if you could just make a few comments on that.
Sure. Well, one thing we wanted to avoid was making our country too focused on ideologies. So we got very pragmatic. And the pragmatism means you put aside colonialism, neocolonialism. We had a difficult history as well. For example, during the Japanese occupation, we had a very difficult challenges dealing with the Japanese occupation during the Second World War. But we could either go over and over again and say, this was bad for us and we're never able to progress, or what we did was work with the Japanese and looked ahead. While remembering the history, you have to be aware of the history, but let's look ahead. Similarly, in terms of the colonial aspect of it, we took the best of the British. They didn't leave entirely all good things, but then we moved ahead and said, let's look at the best of these things, whether it's English, whether it's a trading relationships, whether it's globalization. Other countries, for their own histories, had to make slightly different choices. The Philippines asked the US to leave the bases in Clark and Subic in 1990. And now they actually want the US to come back. And, they were going through a particular phase in their history where they felt that, having the US remain active in the Philippines may not be the best thing for them. They made certain choices. But in Singapore, our whole economic and political approach has been pragmatism. Let's be pragmatic. And you change along the way. As you go along and you find that this has worked for a certain time, it may not work in the future, let's move along. And so we don't get too wedded to any of these isms in a sense. And so even if you try to say Singapore is capitalist or socialist, we're really a mix of everything. There's very strong government involvement in many aspects to help people, health, education, housing, there's very strong government involvement, but the economy is a completely free economy. So, there are every country's got to pick the best parts and then move forward with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ian Christensen. I'm a Chinese major. I just had a couple of questions regarding the South China Sea, sort of tensions right now. My question is, I was just wondering if you could comment on whether you think the United States should be a little bit more aggressive in, deterring China from asserting this territorial claim, and how China's perceived aggressive behavior in this region has caused other Southeast Asian countries to strengthen ties with the U.S., and how you see that developing.
Well, territorial disputes are very complicated. So I wouldn't suggest that one being more aggressive. In fact, aggression makes a region more nervous than the other. Territorial disputes will take a very long time to resolve as well. So I think we've got to be quite realistic. What is the outcome of these disputes and potentially resolving them? There are these group of islands, the South China Sea, and for a long time people just ignored them. And different countries claim different parts. It came to the fore maybe 6 or 7 years ago when China drew something that they called the 9-dash line and said that everything within that 9-dash line belongs to us. We've asked them, and everyone's asked them to clarify it by international law, because international law has a different understanding of how you deal with these territorial disputes, in how you draw boundaries out of that. It's something that has to go through that international legal process. And that's the approach Singapore has taken, that they're going to take a long time to resolve, use international law to resolve it, and meanwhile keep the peace in the system, because we're quite realistic about these things. Philippines have some claims, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei all have claims over there as well. Now, you say the Chinese have been aggressive. I think the Chinese would say that they've actually been slower than everybody else. They put an oil rig in the waters off Vietnam about a year ago. But they said that other countries had put oil rigs over there and no one complained. They reclaimed some of these features earlier this year. And, you know, there were all sorts of photographs in the papers. And, but they said others have reclaimed features as well. But the challenge of China being a large country is sometimes their footprint is much larger than everybody else. I think for them to understand that when you have such a large footprint, maybe you better tread a bit more lightly. And I think that's where the U.S. then has a role to play. Not in aggressively challenging them in the South China Sea, but first being present. And then because the U.S. has a large footprint as well, how has the U.S. managed to tread a little bit more lightly with your footprint that the Chinese can also learn that, you know, big countries scare small countries. I come from a small country. We're scared of big countries. So when a big country does something, you get a little bit anxious. So then the US, China, Russia, all India all have to work out how, as a big country, do you operate with your neighbors? And I think that's the kind of phase that we are in. And that's why in the South China Sea, we're trying to work through a code of conduct that says that, yes, there are disputes. There are countries in the region that are party to disputes and countries that are not party to disputes. But whatever happens there will have a deep impact on all of us. And let's work out that to just avoid a mistake where a fishing boat ends up in the wrong place and is suddenly shot at because they were where they were not supposed to be. Or there is a ship sinks or a plane goes down, we're not able to do search and rescue because we're trying to get approvals around whose territory is this. So let's have some practical measures first. Let's have hotlines that people can pick up the phone and say, you know, maybe let's just check this before we go ahead. And I think the U.S. role is important in all this because the U.S. has to be present. Because by being present, by having your 7th Fleet from Honolulu sailing up and down, by saying that freedom of navigation and overflight is very critical, I think it sets a certain pattern. That large footprint that you have, matching with the Chinese large footprint, and then saying, let's learn how to tread lightly with all these countries. I think that's where I see the South China Sea disputes being resolved. You want to avoid any accidents. You want to avoid any irresponsible behavior. And the disputes will, in the end, have to be resolved bilaterally. The Chinese have to sit with the Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese sit with the Philippines to sort out their disputes eventually. The rest of the regions, our interest is really peace in the whole area.
Cool. Thank you.
My question is...
Can you tell us your name, please?
Yeah, my name is Michael Duvall. I'm an Ancient Near Eastern Studies major, so a little outside the realm here. But my question was kind of about Singapore's economy and its demographics. So you guys have a large migrant community that keeps your population afloat, but the birth rate in Singapore is, by some estimates, the lowest in the world, at under 1 child per family for native Singapore residents. And of course that has an impact on your economy later. So what is Singapore doing to, I mean, are they adopting policies similar to Scandinavia, even though that hasn't worked out as well as they would have liked? What is Singapore doing to make sure that that native Singapore residents have children, or making it easier for them?
Well, first, we don't have a one-child policy.
Right.
That was China.
Right,
That is
right.
China. And even China's had to change. We had a policy that was in the 60s and the 70s when we were a very high growth rate and we were in a push of economic development, was girl or boy, 2 is enough. Because in the Asian family, the boy was more important, so we wanted to say girl or boy. Today, the slogan is have 3 or more, if you can afford it. And in fact, when I met the governor this morning, he told me that in Utah, you have on average 1 child more than the average US families. And so we should take some lessons from you here as well. But I think that Singapore has got all the right neonatal policies today. Parental leave, accounts that sort of, when you have a child, you add in money, the government tops up your money. We give all sorts of approaches to encourage people to have children. But having a child is an emotional, economic decision. You can't force them. We have a couple of Singapore female students from here, and they have decided to focus on professional careers. And that's good for us because we have a very high active female participation rate in the workforce. And so because we don't have enough people, you have to have everyone working. And the challenge has been that, you know, it's a developed country problem that you do find that total fertility rates drop. We are one of the lowest in the world in terms of total fertility. Total fertility should be for replacement 2.1. Singapore is at 1.2, so there's a huge gap over there. We have encouraged inward immigration, qualified people coming in. We also have people coming in almost as guest workers to work on short terms. These are not long-term solutions. You really need what you call native Singaporeans. We feel it's important to have a Singapore core, that people grow up in Singapore, understand what it is to be Singaporean, that the men, all the men in Singapore at the age of 18 go and join the military for 2 years with compulsory national service. They keep going to develop what is this idea of the Singapore core. It's a very major problem because even if you have a successful economy, you want to have a successful economy for your people. And so demographics is a long-term challenge Singapore has to deal with. We have no easy answers. We try everything. We look at all sorts of ideas and policies. But in the end, it's a choice families have to make of having more children. And sometimes the stress of living in a city, maybe they feel that, you know, we'll just have one child or we won't have any children. It's just part of that whole nature of developed economies. So any ideas you have, we're happy to look on and take on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions, and please join me in thanking Ambassador Mirpuri.